Good afternoon and welcome to the Utica Academy for International Studies. We're here with some seniors in the IB 20th Century Topics class and 3 veterans of the Vietnam War. On the left, Mr. Larry Wise. In the center, Mr. Bill Doby. And on the right, Mr. Larry Pretzer. And Mr. Doby, you've got some opening remarks?
Yes, just in the way of a preview of events leading up to the war in Vietnam, called the American War in Vietnam, Vietnam War here. The colonization of Vietnam, French Indochina, began in the late 1850s and was completed in 1893. During World War II, with the defeat of France by Germany, control passed to the Vichy government, a puppet government of the Germans. After the entry of Japanese forces and the double occupation by French and Japanese, the French forces were interred by the Japanese in March of 1945. A deep famine struck in 1944-45 due to grain being impounded for Japanese use, causing the deaths by starvation of between 400,000 and 2 million Vietnamese. During this period, the Vietnamese formed the Viet Minh, an anti-colonial military organization which raided grain storehouses. This increased the popularity of the Viet Minh, and the organization grew rapidly. On August 22, 1945, following the surrender of Japan, American OSS agents arrived in Hanoi to free Allied prisoners of war. Viet Minh forces raided public buildings and armories, securing large numbers of weapons. After the August Revolution, Ho Chi Minh declared the independent Republic of Vietnam with large popular support. With U.S. support, the French returned to their former colony and ruled for nearly another decade. The ongoing conflict ended with the defeat of U.S.-supported French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in May of 1954. The Geneva Conference negotiated a ceasefire between the French and the Viet Minh, and the country was divided at the 17th parallel. The north was controlled by the communist Viet Minh, the south controlled by the government of New Dien Diem. An election was scheduled to decide the question of reunification, but the election was never held. Over 1 million from the north, mostly Catholic, relocated to the south, and perhaps another 2 million tried to leave the north, but were stopped by the Viet Minh. Afterward, with the insertion of U.S. military advisors, a U.S. presence was established. Numbers of advisors were increased by Presidents Eisenhower and later Kennedy. They're concerned that if Vietnam came under the control of the communists, that other neighboring countries would fall to the communists. This was known as the domino theory. It was widely accepted notion, supported by presidents and Congress alike. With years of increased advisor strength, the Diem government continued until November 1963, when Diem was assassinated in a military coup. There's no known connection, but within 2 weeks, President Kennedy was assassinated. In 1964, a naval incident occurred in the Gulf of Tonkin that resulted in the Gulf of Tonkin resolution being passed by Congress and signed by the President. The resolution allowed the insertion of U.S. ground troops into South Vietnam. Millions of Marines were followed by the Army's 1st, 5th, 9th, 1st Cav, 25th Infantry, 4th Infantry, 101st, and 82nd Airborne Divisions, along with other Army brigades, notably the 173rd Airborne, 198th, and 199th Light Infantry Brigades, and others. The Vietnam War was on. U.S. combat troops exited Vietnam on March 29, 1973, and Saigon fell on April 30th, 1975. And the 3 of us are here to speak of our involvement between those years of the buildup and the fall of Saigon. And I guess I would ask Larry to fill us in a little bit, just what his service was, how he entered.
Okay. When I was a senior in high school, I was sitting right where you people are right now, and in our one of our study classes, the teacher told us, all you guys sitting here are going to go to Vietnam. And I didn't believe it at the time. And this was in 1967. And I thought to myself, well, I might get out of it. I was born in a, raised in a middle-class family out in the suburbs of Mount Clemens, and ended up that I did get drafted, along with 6 other friends of mine who were all in the same class together. And we grew up together, went through 12 years of school, and ended up all being drafted. And there was a few who enlisted before because they knew they were going to eventually get into the military either by the draft. So they chose to enter either the Marines or try to get into the Air Force and Navy. But most of us that were drafted were always drafted into the Army. The Army had the most amount of people over there. And we were, at that time, considered almost like cannon fodder. They needed to replace a lot of people. And at the point in time when I was sent over there was 500 and some thousand troops there. And with only a year of obligation duty, there was a lot of turnover in personnel. So a lot of personnel had to be sent in to replace those personnel. And I ended up with the 101st Airborne Division. I was in the combat infantry unit, and the 4th week I was there, I was wounded in a place called the Ashaw Valley. It was a heavily fortified valley controlled by the North Vietnamese. And before the 101st took control of this area, which was in the I Corps, the Marines were there, they got their butts kicked, and they left. And then the Army Special Forces built a camp in there, and they got their butts whipped. And they left the valley. And so when the 101st took control of the valley, we were going to move the Vietnamese out, because it was a main branch of the Ho Chi Minh coming out of Laos through that valley and into the northern city of Da Nang. And we were to interdict all supplies coming through there. And the NVA were going to put up a strong fight, which they did. They never left the valley. They did everything they could to maintain control of all of that area west of Hue, and even with our forces there, we just couldn't do it. The Vietnamese had all kinds of cunning ways of killing, maiming, and they did all their concerted efforts, including suicide, to kill American GIs. I seen a NVA sapper loaded with, strapped with dynamite, walk into our CP and blew himself up and killed all of the members of the CP, the commanding captain and his, it was just an awful experience. They set booby traps. I seen guys get their legs blown off, and it was just not a good experience there. Besides, in a jungle climate as it was, I mean, not only fighting NVA, but it was fighting the elements. We were exposed to everything. In a jungle environment, we lived in, especially where I was, in triple canopy jungle, where the sun never shone down to the ground. And it was always dripping and raining, because it would rain in the afternoon, and the water would just continually drip down through the canopy all day and all night long until the next rainfall came. So we were constantly wet, and we had jungle rot, and we had all kinds of diseases, and the insects and leeches, ants, snakes. I mean, it was tough enough staying alive as it was with the NVA trying to kill you. but the insects and the wildlife were trying to kill you too. So it was, we were virtually on edge 24 hours a day there. Hardly any rest, hardly any sleep. Out there in the mountains, even during the monsoon seasons, it was even tough getting resupply. We lived in basic, terrible conditions. The helicopters couldn't come in. Sometimes we'd run out of food, and we just had to go without. In the summer, when it was 100 and some degrees, we'd run out of water, and we ended up drinking water out of bamboo and chop green bamboo open in between cells. There'd be enough water, for a slug of water to drink. And it was just those basic conditions. It's a lot different now, like in Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever. We lived in primitive conditions. There was absolutely, the resupply system was good, but only as the weather permitted. So, but anyway, after being wounded, I spent 6 weeks in the hospital recovering in Cameron Bay, and after 6 weeks I went back to my unit. And between that time, when I was admitted into the hospital and I got back, 5 of my buddies in my platoon were gone. They were killed. And it was probably the last month of my tour. I was in my 11th month, and I walked point the whole time I was there, which meant I took control of. I walked point because I knew how to read a map. And the point man I had, or slack man as we would call him, he was a former NVA that gave himself up. He Chuhoyed to the South Vietnamese side. So he was trained as a Kit Carson scout. They had special training for North Vietnamese, and they would allocate them to different combat units. And the gentleman I had was he was wounded in the Ashaw Valley and was captured. And instead of spending time in the prison camp, he decided to join or rally to the South Vietnamese side. So he was trained as a Kit Carson scout, and they put him with me. He couldn't speak any English, but and I called him Firefly. That was my nickname for him. And we walked point together. He never walked point, I did. And but his main job was to tell me where there were booby traps, if there were any, or if there was any location of main areas of North Vietnamese. And he didn't do a very good job of it. He was as scared as I was. And when we did get into firefights, he was the first one to run. I mean, he would turn tail. And there was nothing we could do about it, but that was, and he knew what we were up against. But after the 11th month, I told the captain, my CO, I told him, I said, I've been here 11 months, I've been wounded once, and I think my luck's running out, and I'm going home. They called it short. And he says, well, if you can get a guy to volunteer for your position, you're more than welcome to, walk in the patrol or be the last man or whatever you do. You don't have to walk point. So I did get a guy. His name was Jim Swango, and we went out on patrol one day. And Jimmy was, I taught him all I could about walking point. And the CO sent us out on the patrol. And we were in the mountains, and we reached the top of this hilltop, and the NVA was set up there with a ambush. And he was killed instantly. Well, he wasn't killed instantly, but he was shot through the chest several times with an AK-47. And they started throwing hand grenades. And I had, at the time, instead of using my M16, I borrowed one of my buddy's M79. It was a grenade launcher. Looked like a little tiny shotgun barrel, opened up, single shot. So I had a bag of that, and I was in the rear formation, so I kept firing these things off. And it chased the ambush team away. And we also had a tracker with his dog, a scout dog. And the dog was wounded, and he came down the trail past me. And
Excuse me, teachers, could you please release the girls' basketball teams at this time for their away game? Thank you.
and he was yelping, because he got shot in the rear hind, and they dragged Jimmy down to me, and I was behind a log, and he was already turning blue from lack of oxygen, and he died there in my arms, and it was such a terrible experience knowing that this guy volunteered for my position, and he was killed, and it affects me to this day. I always remember his face, and I remember the most vivid thing was him turning blue, lack of oxygen in the face, and he died. And there was nothing I could do about it. He had 3 bullet holes through his chest. And we didn't have a medic. Medic stayed behind that day. And he couldn't save him anyway. But it was quite a harrowing experience, my year there. I thank God. I know that God answered a lot of prayers, and I've seen so much death and destruction that it affected me, and it still affects me to this day. And I suffer from post-traumatic stress syndrome, which I take medication for, I'm treated for through the VA, and it's something that you never forget. And I got to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for what you're doing. You are learning not only just a paragraph or two that's taught in other schools about wars and the devastating effects that they do have, but you guys are actually learning what it's about. Thank you for inviting us to be here with you today. And that's all I got to say. Larry?
All right. Well, again, I'm Bill Dobie. I was, I think he told the story here. There were choices, and we had the same get together. They got us all into the auditorium at school, and it was all the seniors, and of course it was more than one session. But in the session I'm at, well, we had the guys were there, and then the girls were there, and a couple of teachers up front. They kind of took charge of the thing, and they said, some of you folks are planning on getting married. And they said, well, one thing you better keep in mind is that a lot of these young men out here are going to find themselves being drafted or otherwise entering the military. It was just the nature of it at the time. That was in 1965. I guess I'd say honestly, and I remember I told my wife one time, we were down in D.C. and we were in a small diner, and on the end wall they had a picture of John F. Kennedy, the aircraft carrier. And I told my wife that I'd been there with some friends the year before, and I said, if they told me to put me on something like that, I might have joined the Navy. And she said, she didn't want to join anything. I said, no, really. I said, I came real close to joining the Marines. They had this early enlistment program. And it was a 2-year enlistment. You could sign up in June, didn't have to report until September. It was all a good time. And you only had to serve actually about 21 or 21 and a half months. I looked myself in the mirror one day and I said, you don't want to be a Marine. And I must have convinced myself pretty handily, because I put that thought out of my mind, waited about a year, and along came the letter from the draft board. I recall I returned home from work one day, and in my home it was the custom. You could walk in the side door on the landing, and there 4 steps up to the kitchen, and you put your foot up on the 2nd step and untie your shoes, put them down there, you can go trotting through the house with the work shoes. So I put my foot up there, and my mom said to me, she said, here, she said, this came in the mail today. And when you see it's from the White House, you say, well, golly, this must be important. And it was. It said something about my friends and neighbors at the local draft board have selected me for induction into the Armed Forces of the United States. And I said, oh, that's great. So, 26th of September 1966, I was drafted. And we had it was everybody that went to, I assume, Larry, you went through Fort Wayne. And that's the way I went with draftees. You went through, I assume, enlistees also. But you went through Fort Wayne, and you got all your, you received your service number. You were taken over to the old Fort Shelby Hotel for a chicken dinner. We took you over to the old Michigan Central Terminal, the train station. You can still see it down there when you head down I-75. You see it on the left heading south. It was really quite something then. It was quite a place. Not the view you have now with all the windows broken out. That's not what it was. And off we went on the train. We went through the night down to Louisville, Kentucky. Got off the train, got on the bus, went out to Fort Knox. Basic training was started. First thing they did, they cut all of our hair. I remember we were all standing in line at the barber shop with our 35 cents in our hand. That's how much the haircut was, 35 cents. And I can recall we had one guy that I'd gone to high school with, and he had this big, pardon the expression, but they called it the wop job. I mean, he really had it. And he sat in a chair, and this barber took that clippers and it went right straight down the middle of his head. Then he reached over and put the clippers down, reached in his pocket and lit up a cigarette and took a couple of drags and left him sitting there with this wop job cut in half. It was quite something. We had we had one guy he had a Beatle haircut. The Beatles, of course, had come to Detroit in 1965. He had his Beatle haircut, and when they cut his hair, this guy was crying. I'm thinking, wow, take it easy, you know. But it was just part of it. And they do a lot of things with you. And when I say with you, it's as a group. You move into the barracks and you sleep head to toe. And these old barracks, they had every set of bunks up and down had a window. The window was always open. It didn't matter if there was a blizzard outside. 2 inches at the top, 2 inches at the bottom, wanted some air circulation. And of course, they dress you all the same. Now you all got the same haircut. So I went through basic training in C Company, 10th Battalion, 5th Training Brigade at Fort Knox. Completed basic training in early December. They put us on a plane, and we had orders for different members of the platoon had orders for different posts. But it seemed like all the ones that were drafted had orders to go right straight down to Fort Polk, Louisiana, where they had the 3rd Training Brigade. Some of you may have seen a movie a number of years ago, Tigerland. Anybody see that movie? I remember my son came over one day and he asked me, he says, "Hey, Dad," he says, "did you see that movie, Tigerland?" I said, "No, I haven't seen it." He said, "I don't think you're going to like it." And finally I saw it, and he was right. I didn't. It was not the Tigerland that I knew. The whole scenario of the movie was foreign to anything that I had experienced down there, except for the sign. And I told him, I said, "Well, you know, at the beginning of the movie, they're walking into the area, and they got this sign on the side of the road. It says something about entering Tigerland." I told him, I said, "Well, that wasn't the sign." I said, "God, when we were down there, you had a telephone pole on that side of the street and a telephone pole on this side of the street, and about a 6-foot sign running all the way across." And there were tigers on there and little Vietnamese people with their black pajamas and their hats and the rifle and it said entering the 3rd Training Brigade area. And it said in about 2-foot letters, it was Tigerland. And down below it said birthplace of combat infantrymen for Vietnam. And I thought, wow, this is getting off to a bad start, you know. So I was trained as a crew served weapons. My MOS was 11H10, and I was trained in 90 millimeter and 106 millimeter recoilless rifle, anti-tank, and demolitions. So I thought, well, I'm going to go to Vietnam, and I said, that's okay, I'll be riding around on this Jeep with a 106 millimeter recoilless rifle on the back. March 1967. Came home for a couple weeks leave, went off to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and was flown off to Vietnam. We landed in San Francisco, we landed in Honolulu, we landed in Okinawa, where the plane refueled, because one thing they didn't want to do when they got to Vietnam was refuel. They didn't want to be there that long. The plane landed, the door opened, it felt like sticking your head into the oven, because this hot air just rushed in. And this is only March. Well, we were there. So we all lined up, and we were put on buses and taken to a place they call the 90th Replacement Detachment. And what it was an in-country orientation area for replacements for combat units in Vietnam. I was down there for about a week and a half, and they shipped us up, put us on C-130 aircraft, and flew us up to Pleiku up in the Central Highlands. And we got off the plane, and I always laugh when I think about it. I say this ugly. There was another word that came after it, but we'll just call him ugly. Sergeant walked up to us, and we were all lined up, and he said to me, he says, "Well, what's your MOS, boy?" And I said, "11H10, Sergeant." And he said, "You're 11B10 now, boy." And of course, 11B, it wasn't crew served weapons or Jeep with a 106 recoilless. It was just simply small arm infantry. It was a ground pounder and a rifleman. And I gave my buddy an elbow. We had trained together at Fort Polk. Actually, there were about 9 of us that were in the same platoon at Fort Polk that went to the same company. Most of us were in my 2nd platoon. This was, but I told him, I said, golly, I said, we haven't been here 2 minutes yet, and I already got a promotion. That's great. He just kind of looked at me. But, of course, he was 11B also by then. When we went to Pleiku, went to a place they called Camp Inari. Later, they called it Dragon Mountain. At the time we got there in March of '67. They later named it Camp Inari after the first officer in the 4th Division that was killed in action. And we shipped out to a support base, and we joined the company. Now, the company needed a lot of replacements because they had just had a really bad day. 22nd of March 1967, 8th Company, 1st Battalion, 8th Infantry. That's here. 4th Infantry Division had been hit by upwards of a regiment of, or a battalion rather, of North Vietnamese. They had suffered 22 killed, right around 40 wounded. They only had about 115 when they started, so it put a real dent in their numbers. Needed a lot of replacements. A lot of the wounded never came back. These are people that I met years and years later at reunions, but never knew them in Vietnam because they were wounded. They went out, and I joined the company the next day. It was good to meet them because they were part of my company. I'm very proud of having served with 8th Company. In the year that I was in Vietnam, from the actually 1 year and 1 day, from the 13th of March '67 to the 13th of March '68. We had just about 40 men killed in my company, and again, the makeup was usually at a peak 115, perhaps 120. Of course, that doesn't include the wounded. And it was quite a time. I spent time down in the Ia Drang Valley. folks, I think, probably heard something about the 1st Cav Division, the 1st and 7th Cavalry down in the Idrang, the first large-scale battle of the war. And they suffered the 1st and 2nd battalions of the 7th Cavalry Air Cav. Suffered some 200 plus casualties killed during 3 days of that battle. And we were right down there doing the same thing they were doing, out looking for trouble. And sometimes you find it and you take care of it. Sometimes you find it and you get hurt a little bit. And sometimes you find it and you get too much. Been to Gettysburg National Battlefield a number of times over the years. And when I think of 150,000 soldiers, total both sides, within about a 6-mile area, 6 square miles perhaps, or maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less. And I'm thinking, well, golly, that's a lot of soldiers. It really is. We, on the other hand, might have had A Company with 115 or 20 here, and B Company of the battalion would be 2 miles away with another 115 or 20, and C Company was over that way somewhere, a couple miles away, and again, so we had 375 people in that 6 or 7 or 8 square miles. It was quite something. I participated in what they called one of the 10 largest battles, which was called the 9 Days in May, and these ran from the 18th to the 26th of May in 1967. I can tell you the 18th of May we had 30 men killed in B Company, my battalion. We fought them the next day. I had the real honor of serving with 4 Medal of Honor recipients. One of those was when my first sergeant was cited for that action on the 22nd of March. One of them was the platoon sergeant of the 4th Platoon of B Company of the battalion, who I carried out the next morning, carried his body out when we found him the next morning. And 2 others were killed on the 20th of May. And there's nothing to do with me other than I was on the perimeter with them. I'm very, very, very proud of that. And all the folks that we lost over there, I'm just very pleased. I was wounded slightly later in my tour, but not bad. A lot of small shrapnel. I can assure you, it hurt more getting it out than it did getting it in. When all's said and done, I came home. Well, let me tell you, something that sticks in my mind. We had as I said, a good number of folks from my platoon down at Fort Polk, and we served together, and we went 11 months over there, and none of us had gotten a scratch. Well, yeah, none of us had gotten a scratch. So I was in the hospital with malaria for almost 2 months. I was pretty sick, lost about 40 pounds. And I rejoined the company on a resupply, and I walked up the perimeter and I saw a guy who lived down in Pleasant Ridge, Michigan, and his name was Dan Craddock, and I got off the helicopter, walked up the perimeter, and there he was, and he was digging. He was really digging. And I said, "Hi, Dan," and he says, "Oh man," he said, "you came out here at the wrong time." I said, "Well, it was time to come back." So I went up to our area of the perimeter, and we had a couple of guys looking out on the perimeter. And 4 of my buddies were sitting here playing cards, playing Tonk, a game we used to play when we had an opportunity. And I said hi, and he looked up and he said, "Oh, you're back." I said, "Well, it was time." And I told him, I said, "Let me tell you something." I said, "I just came through, now this is February the 8th, 1968. And I said, I just came through base camp, and I said, and I got my orders to get out of here. I said, and I've got your orders too." I said, 10 o'clock in the morning, March the 5th, we fly out of Cameron Bay. And which meant that we had about 26 days left in our tour. And I said, "Man," I said, "we are getting short now in this one guy looked up from his car. His name was Don Dawson. And he looked up from his car and he says, "Hey man," he says, "don't ever say that." He says, "You could die in this place." And I'll tell you the strangest thing, because within about 12 hours he was dead. And I always remembered that. I talked to his parents over the years, but I never forgot that. Never forgot that. We were quite close, having trained together and served for so long in the same platoon. When I came home, I again came down with malaria a few days after I was wounded, and ended up being medevaced out of there. And I didn't have to go through any of what you may have heard of what was going on heavily on the West Coast, which was a bunch of hippies. And I don't have a real strong regard for hippies to this day. But there were many confrontations, many conflicts, and I missed all that because I flew right straight to the East Coast and went to Valley Forge General Hospital in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia. That's the story of my service, and Larry, I'll turn it over to you.
Similar experience in Vietnam, different beginning. I'm not from Michigan. I had 4 years of ROTC in high school and 4 years of ROTC at the University of Hawaii. Completely different time. Commissioned 66. My first assignment was in Berlin Brigade for 1 year, followed by 2 weeks of jungle training in Panama, then went over to, I joined Vietnam when Tet began, and my introduction was the foxhole in the trench, everywhere with no weapon. That's orientation before I even got second corps. When I met up with my first unit, I happened to see one of my classmates from the University of Hawaii going out of control, and that's the last time I saw him. He was killed. I served 6 months with the 101st. I did not get to the ASHA. I was halfway into the ASHA where we were doing the Rome Power operations. I transferred. It was to a new type of unit. It was a MACV advisory group. It was a small, condensed 5-man team headed by an officer, and I had specialist medics, and I had 2 Vietnamese assigned to me, an aspirant and a translator. I never got those initially, so my team initially started off with me and my medic, and then I had one other individual. A firefight, I lost those 2, and then I had to rebuild my team again. The tour is normally a year tour. They had incentives to extend. If you extended for 6 months, you got a 30-day R&R any place you wanted in the world, and in-country R&R. Being a young lieutenant, knowing the military was going to be my career, I enlisted twice or extended twice. So it's a 2-year tour for me. 2 6 months with a lot of vacation times. Let's see, went to Bangkok, went to Hong Kong, went to Hawaii twice, went to Australia, went to Saigon's for the Hawaiian Nubaos. So I did experience a lot of the negatives, the deaths and everything else. Lost a lot of good friends, but that was my career. I left there after that, and I did other things. I retired after 25 years in the military. I ended up in the Middle East. For some reason, there was another conflict going on there when I left and when I came back to. That's all I have. Questions?
What was your rank, Larry, when you retired?
Lieutenant Colonel.
Lieutenant Colonel. Great.
So if anybody has any questions, let's open up the discussion here.
Hi, Tracy. Thank you guys for coming out. So I have a question. What's your opinion on McNamara, and do you support the choices he made during the war?
It's been said of McNamara, and not by me, although I didn't know the man, but I guess I agree with what I heard. McNamara was out of Harvard, was out of the Ford Motor Company. He was a numbers guy, and said of McNamara, or someone said of McNamara, that he was a man that knew the cost of everything and the value of nothing. So I would agree with that as my thoughts on McNamara. I didn't care for the guy personally, but we didn't have any dealings.
Never had any feelings about politics behind the war. The only thing I knew, I survived. And, you know, the war, Johnson escalated the war. And from there, it was to the point where, okay, we're all going to go, we have to do our duty, we're going to serve, we're going to try to make it out alive. And there was a lot of politics behind that, and but that didn't. I didn't care about that. It was just a matter of doing it, getting it done, and doing my duty, honor the country. When we first went in, when I got drafted, National Bill ended up in Fort Knox for basic training. Had some great. Had a great sergeant there. We ended up with as being an honor company after our training, and we were instilled military spirit. And after that, we went down to Fort Hope and for infantry training, and that was the next step before Vietnam. And we learned how to be calm killers. Tigerland was set up. Calm killer #1 drill sergeant when you entered the mess hall. And that was basically put into your brain. So politics were aside. We never thought about it. So other than that, I just, that was it for me.
And
go ahead.
No, go ahead. I mentioned that from Fort Knox, that all of us that were sent to Fort Polk, to the 3rd Training Brigade, Tigerland, were all draftees. At Fort Knox in my platoon, we had USs, that was the draftees. We had RAs, the Regular Army, those were the enlistees. We had NGs for National Guard, ERs were enlisted reserves. And we would call it, you mentioned at the mess hall, you'd line up and the next 5 was US 1 sergeant, ER 2 sergeant, NG 3 sergeant, US 4 sergeant, RA 5 sergeant, and that's how you'd go into the mess hall. Well, there wasn't much of that going on at Fort Polk. We had the sergeant came in, and he was kind of a funny guy. He was an Argentinian by birth, and he says, well, how many of you guys are drafted? Whoa, you know, everybody's wow, he says, so we got any RAs here? And this one guy from North Carolina was back there, this red-headed, freckle-faced, baby fat. This guy had, pardon the slang, but he had hillbilly written all over him. And he's got his hand up. And that sergeant went through that crowd because we had bunks on that side, bunks on this side. We're all standing in the center between these rows of bunks. He went through right back to this guy, and he was way back against the wall. And he stuck his finger in his chest, and he said, let me tell you something. He said, all the rest of these guys here are all drafted. He says, they don't want to be here. He says, but they're here. He says, if they got complaints, it's because they don't want to be here. They were drafted. He says, you enlisted. He says, you got complaints. He says, you keep your mouth, and he had this accent, you know, you keep your mouth shut, you know. I don't want to hear it. And of course he did. But he was the only RA out of, I guess, 54 or so we had in the platoon. I've done a lot of research. I checked that platoon to see how we did in Vietnam. As far as I know, and I may have missed something, very, very possible. Only 2 were killed over there. One was my friend I trained with, died in February. One was captured, and several months later escaped, and they found him and they killed him. And they didn't know what happened to him until 1973 when the prisoners were released, and there were people among those prisoners that had information on him. Aside from that, he was simply captured and considered to be a prisoner of war and missing. It's real proud of my service in Vietnam. I guess truth be told, I thought after I left the Army, I thought, well, maybe I should go back over there, because I really thought that I had learned enough on my tour over there that I could be helpful. I never had a problem with Vietnam. We had, in the early '60s, we had an organization that we belonged to, the United States belonged to, and that was called CETO, and it was the same thing as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and based on their charter of the CETO organization, an attack on one is considered to be an attack on all. Just like NATO, we had a treaty to uphold. I think it was a proper treaty, as I mentioned in my paper at the beginning. The government, I guess I'd say it's similar to what went on in Iraq and what's going on now in Afghanistan. We're there to support the government, and it would have been good if we had a better government to support. Some say that the war could have been won over there. I heard a general one time say that, you know, we could have sealed off that country, and the South Vietnamese could have taken care of the problem inside. We left Vietnam in combat troops were out in '73. The Paris Peace Accords assured us the right to continue to supply the South Vietnamese government with military support. When it came time for the government to authorize, the Congress that is, to authorize that support, they declined it. They pretty well left the South Vietnamese holding the bag. And not only them, we had a great many Hmongs up along the Cambodian border and Laos that were very, very strongly anti-communist and very, very supportive of the United States. And unfortunately, with the Paris Peace Accords, we had to walk out of there. And if I have anything that I consider to be, I guess that I'm ashamed of from my service or our service in Vietnam, it's that we walked out of there and really left them holding the bag. We left them with the 6th largest air force in the world and no spare parts. We left tanks and APCs and guns, and we left all kinds of things behind. Guns aren't any good unless you have ammunition for them. Tanks, again, along with the aircraft, the helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters, you have to have parts, you can't keep them running. And at the end of April in 1975, when Saigon fell, I felt very, very badly about it. Not personally, but just that our government had let the nation of South Vietnam down.
I too would like to thank you three for coming along before I ask my question. It was interesting that you said that McNamara was a man who knew the cost of everything but the value of nothing. Henry Kissinger was once given a similar criticism, and in response he said that too many people try to apply the morals of person-to-person interaction to the morality of state-to-state interaction. So that's how he would have responded, I think, to that criticism. What do you think about this? Do you think that that's a valid response?
Many years later, probably about 6 years ago or so, McNamara put that book out, and he was singing the blues, and not because I didn't approve of him. I think I think years later he found out that he was wrong in his assessment of the conduct of the war, and a great deal of it came out of his term as Secretary of Defense. I saw him on television. I mean, really singing the blues. He was crying during the interview, and I'm thinking, well, where was all this concern years ago? And that's just my view. Again, no interaction there. It's just my own personal.
So we're taught in history that there are these definitive turning points, or dramatic changes, such as the Tet Offensive. That before the war everything was like this, and after the war everything was completely different. When you're in the country, when you're within the day-to-day occurrences, did it feel different before and after? Did the experiences change like how we're taught it did, or did things kind of seem to stay the same?
I would say, and I'll keep this real short, and hopefully somebody else can jump in on it too. I was in Vietnam for the Tet Offensive in 1968. I was up at Dak To. Perhaps in your studies you heard something about Hill 875 with the 173rd Airborne. Well, that wasn't the only hill there, and we were on one of those hills, and saw an awful lot of bodies, a lot of South Vietnamese bodies, a lot of North Vietnamese. Never did see anything of these black pajama people. Along the Central Highlands, you had a hill. So we'd move out in the morning. We used to call it humping, hump up a hill, and you're slipping and sliding. And I remember one time it was during monsoons. As Larry said, it was just amazing how fast it could start raining, and then stop raining just as fast. It was something else. But I can recall slipping and sliding going up a hill, and couldn't hardly see where you're going because the sun was shining in your face. It just started just like that. None of this clouds rolling in or anything, or it looks like rain. No, it was quite something. As I said, I was wounded up there during the Tet Offensive, not badly, and I'm really glad of that. But when you mention about interaction of nations, I guess the Bible says there are always going to be wars and rumors of wars. So it was a long time ago, and somebody was fairly profound to even bother mentioning that. When all is said and done, I guess everybody wished there would be a better way to solve problems between people or nations, but they haven't come up with it yet. And a lot of pretty smart people have tried.
I was there after Tet Offensive, not long after, and at that point in time, yeah, the face of the war changed a lot, and there were search and destroy missions before that was eventually nixed, and while I was there, the Vietnamization of the war occurred, where Nixon had an agenda to train the South Vietnamese forces to fight their own war. And we had South Vietnamese troops attached to us the whole time we were there. And we did the best we could. In fact, one Arvin captain, he trained at West Point and was a very good leader. And oftentimes we fought together, and oftentimes too, there was a lot of miscommunication because of the language barriers and stuff like that. And it was during the finalization of the war that we felt, well, good, now these guys are going to take over. But they really didn't do that much. They threw it all on our backs, and they knew that they really didn't have to do much because the United States Armed Forces would take care of them as long as we were there, and we wouldn't abandon them. But afterwards, when Kissinger signed the peace accords, he kind of, what had happened there was he abandoned the South Vietnamese basically by signing these accords, because the North Vietnamese were notorious for not abiding under any Geneva Convention rules. As you know, how they treated the POWs in the North, and they would do or say anything. It's like the Taliban today. They will say or do anything to eventually get their way. But like I said, I was there after, and it was a totally different war, because a lot of the guys I did serve with were there during the Tet Offensive, and they too told me it was a whole lot different. And it changed dramatically. Larry, do you have anything to say?
I think the Tet was a turning point. That caught the Vietnamese, particularly the Vietnamese, with pants down. The second Tet I was there, completely different. Part of the reasons that the soldiers were released to go back and visit family in a lot of the Oriental cultures, they did that the first Tet, and so they got caught. The second Tet, they restricted the movement of personnel, and so they stayed at post during the holiday seasons. So from my perspective, yes. And the ARVID you're talking about is the active duty. The people I advised were like the National Guard level, the local people.
Popular forces?
Yeah, RFPF. Completely different. They guarded, in my sector, they guarded the Highway 1, which went north to Saigon up to Wei, and they did a really commendable job.
But it was during Tet too that the Viet Cong, after Tet, Viet Cong was no longer a viable fighting force. They lost so many people.
Never again.
And they just were never, and the North, of course, they kept filtering troops down through the Ho Chi Minh, and they were just kids in school, little kids, and they were trained that that's what they were going to do. They were going to go down into the South and fight the United States imperialists. And whether or not they had to ever come back, they didn't care. They were fighting for Ho Chi Minh and their country. And that's the kind of war we fought against them, because they didn't care for their own lives. All they cared about was killing and doing anything they could to kill U.S. troops, whether or not they died in doing so or whatever. But that's kind of, people that we ran into. I don't know if it was I know during World War II with the Japanese, with the kamikazes, to me, it almost felt like the same, it was like the same mentality that the Asian people had at that time. So that's all I got to say. Any more questions?
They did a lot of attacking.
Yeah.
First off, just from our whole school, not just here, I'd like to say thank you for your service to our country. Second of all, I know I've heard multiple stories from my dad, and I don't know if you want to share those, but just dealing with the actual people in Vietnam, the Vietnamese, even just outside of like working with them, and just like the families of the people that may have been around their family that had been killed or that you had killed or just happened to be caught up in the action. How was it dealing with them and dealing with the other things that were coming from the air, like the Agent Orange, just on the front line?
I interacted with a lot of indigenous people there that, of course, most of their sons or dads or whatever were serving them. That was a must. They had to serve in the Army. But in meeting some of the people, to me, they were trying to take advantage of the situation. They had the black markets. They tried to get anything they could out of the American GI. Prostitution was very rampant. They had what they called sickle girls. So brother would take his sister on a little motor scooter and drive around and sell her and for sex.
Never saw those.
No. But anyway, to me, I felt that that the Vietnamese were, I mean, that was my own, how I felt towards them. That we were fighting a war and they were trying to take advantage of the system. And the system wasn't good. I mean, you had rampant black market going on there. In the PX, we could buy a carton of cigarettes. We had ration cards, and we could buy a carton of cigarettes for $2. Sell it to the Vietnamese for $20. They turn around, take the cigarettes out of each package, refill them with marijuana joints, reseal them, and they do this from the bottom so that the stamp was served. Repack the cartons, sell them back to the GIs, and they sell the cigarettes individually for maybe 25 cents a piece to the other Vietnamese. And that's the kind of things that went on there. I mean, it wasn't, and that's what I see, and I can't speak for anybody else, but I did see a lot of corruption in the, civil part of the South Vietnamese. And I know it was rampant throughout the military too, that they did this. And as for Agent Orange, we knew they were spraying Agent Orange. I was sprayed on. I mean, it was all over the place. We drank the water, ate the fish, and some people exposed to it developed cancers and stuff. And how they reacted to it, most likely in the same way. They were human. And they're dealing with it to this day, not only with Agent Orange, but all the unexploded ordnance that's been mines and bombs. And in Europe today, there's still unexploded bombs from World War II. They're finally taken up in some of the large cities there in Germany. And but that's something that they're going to live with for all their lives.
That earlier question about the Tet Offensive, and as I said, I was there for the Tet Offensive in '68, or as I like to refer to it as the real one. It was a pretty big deal. They had later Tet Offensive. I know they had one in '69, but '68 was a real exciting time. And I come away with a real strong sense that, and I've mentioned this in a great many venues, that we didn't, although the war was lost, we didn't lose it. I mean, we that were on the ground, we didn't lose it. We won every major battle, and that war was lost by, I believe, an apathetic government and an apathetic populace, and the news media, I think, was the greatest culprit. And I've long thought, and I think to this day, and I'll go to my grave thinking it, that the Vietnam War was lost by Walter Cronkite. When he said that it can only end in a stalemate, I think he was wrong, but hey, he was Walter Cronkite, and everybody trusted Walter Cronkite. That's where you got your news, that's where you got your information. And I never believed it for a minute at the time. I've never believed it for a minute since then. And those that served in Vietnam, I guess I would say it's sort of like those that served during the Korean War. The Korean War was known as called the Forgotten War. Everybody, you didn't have the whole division coming home on a troop ship and parades in New York or wherever. That was more like Vietnam, where a whole bunch of people came home every day. Once you had enough points, you were out of there. Points for your service. Infantrymen got more points for a month than a cook did. And it's they say that was a tie. It was the Clint Eastwood movie about the Grenada thing. I can't even recall the name of it now, it doesn't matter. But the old Sergeant Major told him, he says, you know, they call us 1-0 and 1s. Well, what do you mean? Like, you won World War, you won one, that was World War II. You didn't lose any, but you had the one tie, which was Korea. And I've always thought that well, there had to be a winner in Korea. There had to be. If there were no winner in Korea during the Korean War, then something else would have to explain an economy in South Korea that's probably 30 or more times that of the economy in North Korea. The South Koreans know. God, we got that book. I should have brought that along. I'll get it to you. We got a book put out by the South Korean government. It's Korea Reborn, right? And it's all about the sacrifice to bring South Korea back from two very heavy invasions from the north. And it's, I will get that to you.
Excellent.
So let me ask one question.
I'd like to say thank you all for serving and thank you for coming today. Mr. Doby, you mentioned that you believe Walter Cronkite lost the war in Vietnam and he was the reason behind that. I wrote my extended essay on that exact topic, and my conclusion was that Walter Cronkite did, in fact, lose the war for the Americans in Vietnam. What was the morale during the Tet Offensive when Walter Cronkite finally gave his report from Vietnam stating that the war was near to stalemate at that point?
You mean where I was?
Yes, what was?
Didn't hear it right away.
You didn't hear it right?
No, we didn't. There wasn't any finish the day and go turn the television on. You know, it wasn't like that.
That's what
I slept in a two-man pup tent, and that's what we did. We walked during the day and we slept in a pup tent between that and pulling guard duty, 2 to 3 hours every night.
We heard very little news coming back from the States, unless it was from our wives or loved ones or whatever, and it was mostly love letters. But, you know, they never talked about politics very much. We heard filtering coming back, and through the Stars and Stripes, the paper, but that was heavily censored also. But what I got to caution you today, and take this to heart, because the media is very biased, okay? They will pick on somebody or something and expound on it, whether it's the truth or not. You have to be open-minded. Don't let the press persuade you in any other way. You know, look at things before you take any, before you make any judgments. Because this is, you know, and even in you have to make your own conclusions. Don't let anybody else persuade you otherwise. And I commend all of you for sitting here today and learning about these things, because it's very important that you grow up and teaching your kids later on the importance of what guys like us and guys before us and that did just to save this country from domination from the Germans or whomever, and to stop aggression. And we are considered the world's policemen, but who else would do it? You know, and it's something that we did in Vietnam. We were the world's policemen at the time, and we stepped in and tried to stop aggression. And it didn't work there. It doesn't work all the time, but it has worked. And I feel proud of myself for being in that, for doing my part. Larry, do you have anything to say?
Larry mentioned the lack of outside information we got. Yeah, occasionally we'd get a resupply and we'd see a Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper they put out. I can recall when I was in the hospital in March of 1968. I came down with malaria again, and then I was medevac. But I picked up a Stars and Stripes and looked at the casualty list, and I saw a young man that I knew from where I grew up in Royal Oak, and I found out later he'd only been in country for about 3 weeks, which I guess is better than 11 months and then getting it. But it was so remote where we were. As I said, no television, no radio. I didn't hear anything about the Detroit riots in August of '67 until they were long over, and my mother had sent me a magazine, U.S. News and World Report or something, and I looked at the cover. It said Detroit burns, and I'm thinking, what's this about? So that's how long after it was. I mean, it was time for the magazine to come out, and then the mail to work its way. So yeah, it was pretty quiet. Nothing right away about anything that Walter Cronkite or anybody else said. But the plain facts are, as Larry alluded to earlier, although we suffered during the Tet Offensive somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 or perhaps a few more deaths of American service members, the number for the Vietnamese was upwards of 50,000. It killed a lot of people, and that's to say the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. It was, except for the more dramatic part of the VC making entry into the embassy in Saigon, getting through the wall and actually into the courtyard. They didn't get any farther. I mean, they got into the courtyard and they died right there. But it made quite a story for the reporters. And rather than wow, look at that hole in the wall and look at what happened. Well, why don't you just show us their bodies, because that's as far as they got. And we paid a heavy price for that particular battle, or those battles during that Tet period, which was pretty much ran up the whole month of February of '68. But we didn't pay the price that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese paid. And I guess I would say if you keep the pressure on, as I said, I've always been proud of my service there. I'm sure I never did anything that I was ashamed of. But it's like what you have now. We went into Iraq, and whoa, there's an explosion in an outdoor market there in Baghdad. The Americans must have done it. Well, okay, well, who did it last week? It wasn't the Americans. And the same explosions are going off. I have no doubt whatsoever that explosion was not the Americans either. But yeah, it's you become a whipping boy and you stand up for yourself or you don't. But lest we digress into too much politics,
Yeah.
I'm going to leave that right there.
The politics are the fun part, but thank you, gentlemen, so much for coming out and talking to us. I know these guys appreciate it.